So, as I mentioned before, after Jesus had me leave church, he had me go on the streets to evangelize. The very first Sunday that rolled around, instead of going to church, he sent me out. I asked him where I should go, and he told me to head to the beach. And what he meant by this was to head to a park that I usually used to visit that had a beach there that I used to also visit. He told me that there would be someone waiting for me there. So I went, and to my amazement, there was a young guy sitting there on a log out on the beach by himself. So I waited and asked Jesus if this was the guy, and just to make sure, and it was. I waited a bit, and I introduced myself, talked to him, asked him if he believed in Jesus. He was an atheist. But we ended up talking for a good 2 hours. And he didn't really convert or anything, but we had a lot of interesting dialogue. Afterwards, when we were finished, we parted ways, and I asked Jesus what the deal was, and Jesus told me that that guy needed someone to talk to, and I was available. So that was my first experience, and I considered it supernatural because I was told to go to that location and there'd be someone there, and there was. I continued going out. I had to fight the temptation to not go out and lazy spirits. And every time I went out and I followed Jesus, I noticed the same pattern that I would see things to the T, or I'd be led directly, without even knowing where I'm going, I'd be led to places and meet people. The first couple weeks, I had trouble starting conversations. I didn't really know what to say. So I asked Jesus what I should say to people. He gave me something I would consider like a word or a kind of a springboard for Christians, as I mentioned before. It's what I asked the pastor in the last video. This was the message that Jesus pretty much had me open up with believers when I met them. I'm going to go through that in a little bit more detail right now. I would ask people if they believed in Jesus, or if they went to church, or ask them something about religion circulating around Jesus or what they believed. If they did believe in Jesus, the question then was, have they come to know him since they believed? This is what Jesus told me to ask them. He then had me listen to their testimony, and usually people would respond with things like, oh yeah, I know him, he answers my prayers, or I go to church, or some miracle that happened to them. And then Jesus would have me explain how, the President of the United States, we all know about him, and if we were to write him a letter, we might get a response back. That doesn't mean we know him. And we can go to conventions, we can go to White House tours and stuff and have people talk to us about him, but that doesn't mean we know him either, just like how people just go to church. And using myself as an example in this parable, I would say to them, they just met me, and if they asked me to do them a favor and I did it, it doesn't mean that they know me. And I showed them what the scriptures stated. Jesus had me open up the scriptures and show them that the scriptures say, this is how we know him, if we obey his commandments. And the one who says, I know him, and does not obey his commandments is a liar, and the truth isn't in him. And he had me show them other scriptures as well. This was my common type of opening with Christians. I even developed a tract that I used to hand out, and it would have basics on ceasing from sin and faith towards God and so on. And it would also have the same scriptures that I would reference when I speak to people. So it was a lot easier to show them the scriptures on a piece of paper than having to flip open the Bible every time. So this is how he directed me with Christians, and then the conversation he'd lead me as the conversation flowed. So I at least had a nice opening, and it was a beautiful opening. I found it to be very, very, very successful for the mission that he had me out there doing. Now, I was not yet perfect in obeying his instructions. I was still struggling with some instructions, as I mentioned in my Crazy Temptations video. However, I did at least have the testimony that before I was sinning, not caring, sinning, wanting to stop, knowing nothing of what to do, but now I was actually learning. every time I messed up, I knew why, and I was given an instruction of what to do, or a reminder of what I was supposed to be consistent in. So I always had grace, which is exactly what Paul talks about. If sin abounds, grace much more abounds. So I was able to still share with them the testimony of learning how to cease from sin, which I wasn't even getting that in church. And this is what Jesus wanted me to give to people. I especially saw more success speaking to younger people. And when I say younger, I'm speaking about like high school and up. He had me speaking from teens to elderly people. I was given what to say to all types of people. To atheists, Hindus, Muslims, evolutionists, you name it. Jesus made sure I was never confounded in the subject of salvation. When I spoke to people, which the subject was only salvation, I always had the right wisdom to give, and even if people did not agree, usually they just get angry and flare up and then eventually leave or just hold stubbornly to their beliefs. Even if I did not have the answer, Jesus would give me the answer on the spot. For example, one time Jesus told me to ask an atheist, what does it mean to believe something? And while he was giving me his beliefs on it, Jesus at the same time was giving me the answer because I didn't even have that answer. And the answer he gave me was an answer I never heard anywhere else before. In a nutshell, to summarize that answer, Jesus explained to me that belief determines how we live. It's when we choose to invest in any subject based on our perceptions and or desires. But belief does not determine the truth. It determines how we live. And that's why it's important that we believe the truth and not lies. A lot of people treat their beliefs as evidence of truth towards what they believe. And that's what a lot of atheists do, as well as Christians and pretty much everyone regarding the things that they love and they cherish and they choose to invest in. But that's an example of how I'd be on the streets talking to people and Jesus would just be downloading and dropping things on the spot to give to people. I found that not very, very, very many Christians were listening. Christians were the hardest people to speak to. And I talked to I don't know how many people in 2 years, between 2012 and 2014. Now I'm going to go through a couple of the experiences. And the reason why is because these experiences I hold pretty close to my heart. They're experiences I treasure. I didn't really experience this kind of stuff in church. And it was cool that I started experiencing it on the street. I have a lot of testimonies in this area. Like I said, I'm only going to go through a few here, but even these few don't even touch the amount of experience I had out on the streets. First one, there's this girl I spoke to who, when I asked her what she believed, she said she was an atheist. So I went through the usual rundown, and by the time we finished speaking, to my surprise, she said she was going to go home and pray. She was inspired by my testimony about how we can hear the voice of Jesus and he can speak to us and he will lead us and guide us. We just need to trust in him and believe. I don't believe this girl was truly an atheist. She, to me, sounded like a lost sheep, and I spoke to a lot of lost sheep. And to define lost sheep, Jesus showed me that lost sheep are people out there who actually do believe in him. The problem is they just didn't learn the truth about him to believe in him. But once they hear the truth, they jump on it. Because that's exactly what happened with her. There's another situation with these 6 young boys that I met. The night before, I had a vision where I saw an ultraviolet light hit my ceiling and I saw a white outline of a cross. Just like how you could shine those UV lights on surfaces and then you can see like past stains and stuff. I saw a smear of a cross. I went out street evangelizing that day and I came across these youth, and one of them, I believed in Jesus. The rest of them were atheist or agnostic. From what I remember, there could have been maybe another guy in there who may have believed. But generally speaking, they weren't actually practicing Christians if they did confess that they did believe in Jesus. But most of them were atheists and agnostic. I started talking to them and going through the usual, how I usually start things off, and they didn't really seem to be that interested. Continued talking to them for a bit. Then somehow I brought up supernatural stuff. I was talking about dreams and visions, and they were super interested. Now, we continued speaking for a good 4 hours that evening. We ended up walking and just talking. And through speaking, they actually told me a testimony of theirs about how they're over at one of the guy's houses, and the guy's sister ends up drawing crosses on all their foreheads with an invisible marker that could only be seen with a UV light. I did not tell them about my vision, which I should have. I don't know why I didn't share it. I don't know why. So if any of them are listening to this testimony right now, I did have a vision of that beforehand. Now, we continued talking, and eventually I did get a chance to explain Jesus and explain salvation and everything to them. And I don't even remember how it came up, but we talked about prayer, and they were ready to pray. They wanted to try praying. So we went to this plaza, and by now it was evening time. It was beginning to get dark. We huddled up in a corner, and we just prayed, and Jesus moved. He moved. He touched these guys. And I've experienced this every time I prayed on the streets. I've been to bars where a brother and myself, we would go to this bar, and we'd pray for the waitresses and bartenders and stuff that served us, and Jesus would move on them. That's the testimony for another time. But with these guys, Jesus moved on them. Some of them started vibrating. They felt something, and Jesus touched them. We continued talking, and they repented on the spot. They had a bong on them. They were actually planning on doing drugs and drinking that night. And they tossed the bong and into a giant garbage compactor. They tossed the alcohol away. Instantly, they were confessing they were Christians. We ate, we had some pizza, we just continued talking and fellowshipping. Now, when it was time for them to go back home, I told them I was willing to go to their house and actually talk to their families, which I really wish I could have done, but they didn't really want to. They were ready to go home and just confess about the alcohol and apologize and whatnot. I really think it would have been good for me to be able to go, but they didn't want me to have to come in, so I didn't. I tried to catch up with them on Facebook, but we just started getting distanced. I did see a couple of them here and there afterwards, but it wasn't really the same. One of their moms tried to reach out to me through my website, which she would have gotten off my track, but she didn't leave her proper email address, and I was unable to get back to her and respond to her and answer any of her questions. So it was just sad how it all worked out. So I don't know. I guess Jesus just used me to plant some seeds. But I tried to water, and my experience in trying to water was not very successful. My experience out on the streets was a seed planting ministry. I didn't really have a chance to water very many people, but Jesus had a plan in this, which I'll be explaining a little bit later. The times I did get to water were times I would speak to people, and they'd tell me that I was the second or third person, I think even one time fourth person, to say that to them that day. And this happened not all the time, but it did happen definitely more than once. It happened a few times. Now, other times I'd run into people again, but even then I would consider that to plant more seeds, not so much really water. So anyway, there's those 6. There was this time where Jesus just sent me to that same park that I used to go to that had the beach. He had me wait on this slab of concrete that sticks out almost like a dock. He told me to wait here, there's people coming, to speak to them. 5-10 minutes later, these 2 girls showed up. They're Muslim. I went through everything with them. One didn't really receive. The other one, she really received, and she was pregnant. And she said she was going to go home because she had some serious things to think about with what I had laid out regarding Jesus and Islam. I had a situation where I met a Hindu guy, an ex-Hindu now. I ran into him a few times. There's people I used to run into on the regular. I'd pass by because it's the neighborhood, so you're gonna run into the same people. In fact, I ran into a lot of the same people. Sometimes I forgot who some of these people were. This guy, he was a Hindu. I spoke to him about Jesus. He believed in Jesus. He had Jesus amongst the rest of his gods, and I basically gave him the usual rundown of, hey, well, there's such thing as idolatry, and that God considers that adultery with him. Like, we're supposed to only worship one God. We're supposed to have him, and he can do everything for you, he can sustain you, and so on. He really listened to what I had to say, and the next time I saw him, he told me that he threw out all the other idols and all he had, and he pulled out a keychain and had a picture, the traditional picture of Jesus, quote end quote. And he said, "Yeah, now all I have left is Jesus. I carry him everywhere I go." I didn't even touch that keychain. I was so happy, and at the same time, it just seemed really cool that he got rid of all the other idols, but he was still holding on to Jesus. Jesus did not convict me to say anything about that. He had me leave that alone because he made a major step there. Jesus showed me not to touch that he would deal with it over time. But yeah, it was really cool. I did end up seeing that guy a few times afterwards. We would fellowship, we would pray. It was always a breath of fresh air meeting up with him. There's times that I'd end up going to people's houses. People would invite me in, or invite me to their house a little bit later to have dinner or whichever. Some people would invite me to their church, and I would go. This was actually very common. This happened fairly often in the later portion of the season of me doing this evangelizing. I had a lot of different types of experiences out here on the street. A lot. However, the biggest problem with this experience was that when it came to Christians, I only met one person who was a sister. Everyone else did not know Jesus. There's one girl, she came from her hometown, walked to mine, sat there at the bench, and when I spoke to her, she was the first and only person I spoke to who told me she believed in Jesus. She knows him because she obeys him. He speaks to her. And she was even able to go as far as tell me what she was working on at the time. And she told me straight she was working on pride. But apart from that, she did not sin. And she agreed with the things I was saying. One person in 2 years speaking to I don't know how many people. And this ratio is in the Bible. Jesus said few people find the path to life, and many are on the path to destruction. I've found very, very few people who found the way. In this one season, I only found one. And I'm not the only one that experienced this type of ratio when it comes to evangelizing. I have a brother in the States who had fellowship with when after coming home from evangelism. Jesus had him on the same schedule as myself, even though we were on different time zones. We were out at the exact same time. We would come in, and then we would talk about our outings and what happened and what Jesus would do with us. He experienced a lot. He experienced worse. He didn't meet any brethren at all. He just met a lot of people who said they were Christian, and they weren't. They weren't by biblical definition. They believed they were Christian because of the church doctrines that they believed, or the fact they went to church, or the fact that they had an experience with Jesus, but they weren't actually following Jesus, and they weren't taught by him. They were part of his people, but they weren't actually following Jesus. They weren't children of God, as what the Bible defines. I have a brother who, at the same time, was doing what I was doing and what this other brother was doing, but he was doing it at his school, because he was still in high school at the time, and he went around that high school doing the exact same thing. So I wasn't the only one, and again, this was just this season of evangelism. This doesn't include my traveling around North America. This doesn't even include Facebook. When I was on Facebook, still preaching online, even during this season, even talking to pastors online, the consistent testimony is that Christians do not know Jesus. And this is why I'm sharing this situation here, this whole evangelism testimony. I'm going to end this video here. There's still more to say about this. There's some other experiences that have happened, but I'm going to bring them up in another video concerning the men's prayer group and some things that have transpired there. I'm going to end this video here. In the next video, I'm going to cover spiritual warfare and what I learned about demons. And in this video, I'm going to explain how I, having the Holy Spirit, still had demons in me that Jesus cast out.